The morning Nora Ashwell turned 18, the sky over Billings was the color of old concrete. Not gray exactly, something duller than gray. The kind of sky that doesn't bother to make promises. She had been watching it since before dawn, lying on her narrow mattress in the room she shared with two other girls, listening to the building wake up around her. The pipes knocking in the walls, the shuffle of feet in the corridor, the distant clatter of the institutional kitchen beginning its morning routine. These were the sounds she had learned to live inside for the past 2 years, and today was the last day she would ever hear them. October 19th, the day she had been dreading since she first understood what it meant. In the foster care system, turning 18 was not a celebration. It was an expiration date. Nora sat up slowly and looked around the room. Her two roommates were still sleeping, their faces soft and unguarded in the gray morning light. They were younger. They still had time. She had already packed the night before, which hadn't taken long. Everything she owned fit into a single backpack with room to spare. A few changes of clothes, a worn paperback she had read so many times the spine had given out, a photograph of her parents taken before everything fell apart. Marcus and Celeste Asherwell standing in front of a Christmas tree laughing at something outside the frame. She kept that one folded inside the book so she wouldn't have to look at it unless she chose to. She had not chosen to look at it in 7 months. She carried the backpack down the hall to the bathroom, washed her face, studied herself in the mirror for a moment. Brown eyes, dark circles beneath them. A jaw that had grown sharper in the past 2 years, as though her face had been slowly excavating itself, stripping away everything soft. She was not the same girl who had walked into this building at 16. That girl had still believed that loss was temporary, that things ended and then something else began. She knew better now. The administration office smelled like stale coffee and copy paper. Mrs. Dunmore, the facility director, was already behind her desk when Nora knocked, which meant she had been expecting her, which meant she had prepared herself for this conversation. Nora recognized the look on the woman's face. She had seen it dozens of times over the past 2 years on caseworkers and counselors and family court judges. It was the look of someone who has made peace with delivering pain because they have convinced themselves that the pain is necessary and therefore clean. "Nora," she said, "happy birthday." Nora sat down without being asked and folded her hands in her lap, a habit she had developed somewhere in the machinery of the system. Stillness as armor, stillness as invisibility. Mrs. Dunmore opened a drawer and produced a folder. The usual materials, a list of emergency shelters and Billings, contact information for a job placement program, a bus pass valid for 30 days, a pamphlet about transitional housing for aged-out youth, its cover featuring a photograph of a smiling young woman that Nora found almost offensively optimistic. "You know what today means," Mrs. Dunmore said. "We've discussed it. There are resources available to you. I'd encourage you to use them." Nora took the folder. She had known this was coming for 2 years. She had rehearsed her response so many times it had long since stopped feeling like anything. But then Mrs. Dunmore reached into the drawer again. "There's something else," she said, and her voice shifted. Something in it went uncertain in a way Nora had never heard from this particular woman who ran her facility with the calm efficiency of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. "There's something that came with your file when you entered the system. There were instructions attached. It was only to be given to you on your 18th birthday. Not before." She set it on the desk between them. An envelope, cream-colored heavy, sealed with a wax stamp pressed with an unfamiliar insignia, and across the front in handwriting that stopped Nora's breath completely, her name. She knew that handwriting. She would have known it underwater in the dark at the end of everything. It was her mother's. Nora's hands were not entirely steady when she reached for it. The paper felt different from ordinary paper. Heavier, loaded with something she couldn't name. She broke the seal. Inside were three things. A key, iron, old-fashioned heavy in a way that seemed disproportionate to its size. The bow was ornate, the kind of craftsmanship that belonged to another century. Rust had settled into the crevices. It looked like something that might unlock a door in a house that no longer existed. A document printed on legal paper. At the top, two words, claim deed. Below that, a description of property. 5 acres in Driftwood, Montana, including a dwelling and appurtenances and one windmill. The purchase price listed was $5. The transfer date was listed as the recipient's 18th birthday, and a letter. 2 pages. Her mother's handwriting. Every loop and curve and slight leftward slant exactly as she remembered. She looked up at Mrs. Dunmore, who was watching her with careful neutrality. "I'll give you a few minutes," the woman said, and left the room quietly, which was perhaps the kindest thing she had ever done. Nora read the letter. "My dearest Nora, if you are reading this, then the thing we feared most has already happened, and I am so deeply sorry. I am sorry I am not there to watch you become the woman I always knew you would be. I am sorry we had to leave you and Eli alone in a world that is not kind to children without someone to protect them. But there are things you need to know, things we kept from you because knowing would have put you in danger. And the most important thing, the thing I need you to hear before anything else is this. We did not have an accident. We were killed. Your father found something at Van Thorn Mining. He was working as a geological engineer on land surveys when he discovered what they had been doing. Since 1984, Nora, for more than 20 years, they have been dumping chemical waste into the groundwater across 5 counties in Montana, quietly, systematically, in places where the people are poor and isolated and unlikely to be believed if they complain about the water tasting wrong or their children getting sick. Your father documented everything, took samples, recorded meetings, built a case that would have destroyed them. They found out. They made it very clear what would happen to our family if he went forward. They knew your names, Nora, yours and Eli's. They knew which school you attended and which route you walked home and what time you usually arrived. We had no choice but to plan. The land in Driftwood, we purchased it in secret through a trust in cash. We were going to disappear. Start over somewhere they would never think to look. We were days away from bringing you both there when they ran us off the road. The property is yours now. Legally, irrevocably yours. The key opens the front door. In the cellar there is a galvanized milk can. Everything you need is inside. The truth about what your father discovered. Instructions for what to do next. Money to help you start. A lawyer named Grafton Payne helped us set up the trust. His information is enclosed. He has been waiting for this day. Go to Driftwood, Nora. Do not tell anyone where you are going until you know who you can trust. And whatever you do, do not let them take it from you. They took our lives. Do not let them take the future we tried to build for you and your brother. I love you more than I have ever known how to say. I love you both more than anything this world gave me. Go. Find it. Fight for it. All my love always. Mom. Nora sat in that office for a long time. The morning light shifted through the single window. Somewhere in the building, a bell rang signaling breakfast, and the ordinary machinery of institutional life continued its indifferent rotation. But inside Nora Ashwell, something ancient and structural gave way. She had spent 2 years believing she was the daughter of accident, a girl who had lost her parents to nothing more than bad weather and bad luck, and the random cruelty of a universe that occasionally destroyed families for no reason at all. She had built her entire understanding of herself around that absence, around the randomness of it, around the terrible democracy of disaster which chooses no one in particular and therefore cannot be argued with. But her mother's letter did not describe an accident. It described a decision, a deliberate, calculated act carried out by men who had weighed the cost of her parents' lives against the cost of their exposure and arrived at a number they found acceptable. The grief that moved through her was unlike anything she had felt in 2 years of grieving. It was not the dull chronic ache she had learned to carry. It was sharp and fresh and devastating, the grief of learning something for the first time, even though the loss itself was old. Because in a way, she was learning of their deaths for the first time. The parents she had mourned were not entirely the parents she had lost. The truth was larger and more terrible and somehow more full of love than she had known. They had not left her. They had been taken. And in being taken, they had left her everything they could. She put the documents back in the envelope. She stood up. She walked out of the office past Mrs. Dunmore, who said something she didn't hear, and down the corridor toward the common room where she knew Eli would be. He was sitting at a table near the window with his sketchbook open in front of him. 14 years old, her brother, and already carrying himself like someone who had learned that the world was not reliably kind. He had retreated further into his drawings over the past 2 years, filling page after page with the landscapes of his imagination. Houses mostly, houses with wide porches and smoke from chimneys, and the kind of light that falls on places where people feel safe. He looked up when she came in. Something in her face told him what was coming because his hands stilled over the page and his eyes went wide and careful the way they always did when he was bracing for something. Today, he said. Today, she said. She sat beside him close enough that their shoulders touched. On the page before him was a drawing she had not seen before. A house simple and solid with a wide porch and a garden. And beside it, rising tall against a carefully shaded sky, a windmill, its blades stretched outward like arms. She stared at it. Eli. When did you draw this? He looked at it. Last week, I think. Maybe before. He paused. Why? She pulled her mother's letter from the envelope and held it without showing him the words. There's a place, she said carefully. A house that Mom and Dad bought for us before everything happened. They were going to take us there. His eyes didn't move from her face. I have to go there, she said. I can't take you yet. There are things I have to figure out first. But I'm coming back for you, Eli. I swear it on everything I have. I'm going to make a place for us. A real place. And when it's ready, I'm coming back and getting you out of here. He was silent for a moment. Then he tore the page from his sketchbook slowly and carefully and pressed it into her hand. His face was controlled in the way she recognized the way their mother had been controlled in moments of high feeling, that stillness that was not coldness, but its opposite. Take it with you, he said, so you know what it's supposed to look like. She folded the drawing and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket. She could feel it there against her ribs when she hugged him goodbye. She held on longer than she usually allowed herself to. She walked out the front door of the Billings Transitional Youth Facility at 11:47 in the morning with a backpack, a bus pass, $42 in cash, a cashier's check for $500 that she found behind the deed in the envelope, and a key made of iron that was older than anyone she had ever known. She did not look back. The bus to Cedar Hollow departed at noon. Nora bought her ticket at the counter and found a seat near the back, pressing herself against the window as the city began to recede. She had never been particularly attached to Billings. It was just another stage of the transit her life had become. But watching it pull away through the smudged glass still felt like losing something, and she let herself feel it for exactly as long as the outskirts lasted. Then she opened her mother's letter and read it again. She read it 3 times before she put it away. Each time she finished, she sat with the last line. I love you more than I have ever known how to say. She thought about what it cost to know a truth and bury it rather than let it touch the people you would die for, which, as it turned out, was exactly what her parents had done. They had died for it. They had chosen the burial of one truth over the burial of their children. She looked out the window. Montana was unreeling past her in long, slow panels, the city giving way to suburbs, then to farmland, then to the kind of open country that makes you understand why people once believed the earth was infinite. Rolling hills gone yellow with late-season grass, pine forests pressing close to the road, mountains far to the west with the first snow already on them, white against a sky that had finally found some color as the afternoon advanced. She had grown up in cities and suburbs, cycling through foster placements in places where the horizon was always interrupted by buildings. She had never seen country like this. It made her feel small in a way that was not unpleasant. Small and very far from everything that had gone wrong. The bus made 3 stops before Cedar Hollow. She got off at each one briefly, stretching her legs, buying water and crackers from the first station's vending machine. At the second stop, she called the number on Grafton Payne's card from a payphone and got a recorded message confirming that the trust had been fully activated on this date and that the property was hers. She stood at that payphone for a long moment after the call ended, listening to the dial tone. She was the legal owner of 5 acres in Driftwood, Montana. She did not know what that meant yet. She did not know what anything meant yet. Cedar Hollow was barely a town, a gas station, a diner with a neon sign that buzzed and flickered, a covered waiting area with wooden benches where a few passengers disembarked and were immediately absorbed into waiting cars. A single street lamp, darkness pressing in around the edges of its light. Nora stepped off the bus at 10:17 in the evening. The cold hit her immediately. Montana cold was different from city cold. Cleaner, sharper. It carried with it the smell of pine resin and distant snow and something older she couldn't name. She pulled her jacket tighter and looked east. Driftwood was approximately 2 miles by road. There was no taxi service. There was no bus going further that night. There was nothing but the road, in the dark, in the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. She started walking. The road to Driftwood was unpaved and rutted, bordered on both sides by pine forests that blocked the stars except for a narrow strip directly overhead. She had bought a small flashlight at the last station, and its beam cut a thin path through the dark ahead of her. The woods were alive with sounds she couldn't identify. Rustling, movement in the underbrush, the sudden sharp crack of a branch somewhere in the trees that made her stop and hold very still for a count of 5 before she continued. She had never been particularly afraid of the dark. In the foster system, she had learned that the things worth fearing usually had faces, and this darkness was faceless. This darkness was just nature being itself, enormous and indifferent and not interested in her specifically. She walked. She thought about her father. Marcus Ashwell had been the kind of man who could fix almost anything. Cars, appliances, the wobbly chair that no one else bothered with. He had a patience with broken things that she had always admired without fully understanding. He would sit with something that wasn't working and look at it for a long time before he touched it, as though he were listening to it, trying to understand what had gone wrong from the inside rather than imposing a solution from the outside. She had thought that was just how he approached objects. She understood now that it was how he approached everything. He had gone to work for Van Thorn Mining the way he went to work for anyone, with his tools and his patience and his gift for listening to what the land was trying to say. And the land had told him something terrible, something that should have stayed quiet, something that powerful men had invested 20 years in keeping quiet. He hadn't been able to let it go. She understood that about him. She recognized it in herself, the inability to look away from something wrong simply because looking away would be easier. The sign appeared in her flashlight beam before she registered the town itself. Wooden half consumed by ivy, the paint faded to near illegibility. Welcome to Driftwood Population 34. The number had been crossed out once and corrected downward to 31, then crossed out again. The final number was too weathered to read. Driftwood was a ghost, a crossroads with the memory of a community still clinging to it like frost. A church with boarded windows. 3 or 4 houses dark and seemingly empty, their lawns grown back to meadow. A gas station with pumps from a different era, the kind with analog dials and hoses caked in rust. A single light burning somewhere distant. The whole place felt like something held underwater for too long. Still shaped like what it had been. Changed in ways that couldn't be reversed. Miller Road was a dirt track branching east from the main road. More suggestion than infrastructure. Her flashlight caught the ruts of old tire tracks and the pale stalks of weeds that had grown up through the middle since the last time anyone had driven it with regularity. She turned onto it, and then against the star-scattered sky she saw it. She stopped walking. The windmill rose from the darkness like something from another time. It was tall, taller than she had imagined, a skeletal structure of metal and aged wood. Its 4 blades extended at irregular angles as though frozen mid-rotation. Rust had transformed it into a deep reddish brown that caught the starlight differently from the sky around it. Several of the blades were bent. One had a section missing entirely. It stood perfectly still in air that was moving at a gentle, constant pressure, as though it had simply forgotten how to move. She recognized it, not from memory, from the drawing in her pocket. Eli had drawn this exact silhouette, before he knew it existed, before she did. He had pulled it out of some place beneath ordinary knowing and put it on paper with the focused patience that came over him when he was drawing something that mattered. She stood on Miller Road in Driftwood, Montana at 11:13 in the evening and looked at the windmill her brother had drawn from a room in Billings and felt something shift in her understanding of what was happening, something she didn't have words for yet. The house was behind it, set back from the road. Her heart sank before she could stop it. The photographs her imagination had assembled on the bus bore no meaningful resemblance to the structure before her. The porch roof sagged at both ends, held up at the center by columns that had rotted through in places and been approximately repaired with boards that had also begun to rot. The windows were all broken, their glass gone, the openings covered in some places with boards that had warped away from the frames over years of Montana winters. The paint had entirely surrendered to the weather, leaving the underlying wood gray and deeply weathered, the color of something that has given up but not yet fallen down. Weeds had consumed the yard to a height that obscured the lowest porch step. This was her inheritance. She stood in the dark and looked at it for a long time. The temptation to turn around was real and heavy, and for a few moments it had the quality of gravity. She could walk back to Cedar Hollow. She could find the diner, spend the night, catch whatever passed for a bus in the morning. She could take the $500 in the cashier's check and find a shelter in Billings and figure out the slow, ordinary path forward. She could let Van Thorn mining continue to exist undisturbed. She could let her parents be remembered as nothing but accident. She put her hand in the inside pocket of her jacket and felt the folded drawing Eli's windmill house pressed against her palm. Then she walked up the path to the front door. The steps complained but held. The door was swollen in its frame, the wood warped by 2 decades of moisture cycling through it. The lock was another matter. The mechanism was heavy iron, the same vintage as the key, and it had been made to last in a way that more recent things were not. She worked the key into it, felt the resistance, pressed her shoulder against the door, and twisted with the full weight of her. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then something internal gave way with a sound like a complaint that had been held back too long, a long metallic protest, and the door swung inward. The air that came out was cold and still and tasted of time, of sealed rooms, of the smell that accumulates in spaces that have been waiting for someone to return. She stepped inside. Her flashlight moved across the room. Dust moved in its beam like something alive. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling in configurations of extraordinary delicacy, the architecture of years of patient work by small creatures with no interest in human schedules. In the center of the room stood a table and 2 chairs, all of it blanketed in gray dust of a thickness that suggested not abandonment, but geological deposition. Something left so long that the leaving itself had become part of the material reality of the place. On the far wall, a door, plank construction, small iron latch. In the cellar, there is a galvanized milk can. She crossed the room. Her footsteps left clear prints in the dust. She lifted the latch. She pulled the door open. Below her, a set of stone steps descended into complete darkness. The smell that rose from below was different from the smell of the main room. Earthier, colder. The smell of ground that had been enclosed and left alone long enough to develop its own atmosphere. She took one breath and went down. The cellar was small and stone-walled, the floor packed earth. Empty shelves lined one wall, still bearing the rings and shadows of the jars that had once stood on them. Her flashlight swept the space methodically, and there in the far corner, half behind a stack of rotting firewood, she found it. A galvanized steel milk can, old and dull-surfaced and absolutely intact. The kind of thing made in an era when things were made to outlast their purpose. She knelt beside it. The lid was sealed tight against years of pressure, and she worked at it with both hands, her fingers going raw from the cold metal, until it released with a sound like an exhaled breath. She shone her light inside. The money was there, stacked in careful bundles wrapped in newspaper and secured with twine. She didn't count it immediately, but she would count it later, twice sitting on the cellar floor with her back against the stone wall. $50,000, saved and hidden and left for her in a steel can in the ground of a state she had never visited by parents who were 2 years dead, and who had known when they were still alive and breathing and making plans, that she might need something to start with. But the money was not what stopped her breathing. On top of the money sat a waterproof document box, hard plastic, the kind built to survive flood and fire. She lifted it out. She worked the latches. Inside, she found letters, dozens of them, her mother's handwriting on every envelope addressed to her and Eli. She found legal documents dense with the language of trusts and deeds and transfers. She found photographs. Her parents, young and smiling, she and Eli as small children, all of them captured in moments of ordinary happiness that now had the quality of dispatches from a country that no longer existed. And she found something else, a photograph she had not seen before. Her father in a suit he rarely wore, standing in what appeared to be an office building lobby, shaking hands with a man in an expensive gray suit. Her father's expression was carefully neutral, in a way she recognized the way he looked when he was hiding something he considered important. The other man was silver-haired and patrician, smiling, with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being photographed. On the back in her father's handwriting, "He knows everything, has known since the beginning. He is why they were never stopped. Name in file 3. She turned the photograph over and looked at the man's face again. Silver-haired, patrician, smiling. A man who looked like someone's idea of authority. The kind of man who got re-elected because he looked the part. She set it down carefully on the stone floor beside her. She had come to Driftwood believing she was fighting a corporation, a company run by greedy men who had decided that the cost of hiding their crimes was lower than the cost of being held accountable for them. That was already enormous. That was already more than an 18-year-old girl with $42 and a broken inheritance should be expected to take on alone. But her father's handwriting said otherwise. He knows everything, has known since the beginning. He is why they were never stopped. Van Thorn Mining had not survived 20 years of poisoning 5 Montana counties simply because they were careful. They had survived because someone with the power to stop them had decided not to, had looked at the evidence and the victims and the contaminated groundwater and had made a calculation and signed his name to documents that said everything was fine. Someone with a face in a photograph and a name in a file she hadn't yet read. Nora sat on the cold dirt floor of the cellar her parents had prepared for her, surrounded by the evidence of everything they had tried to do and everything that had been done to them, and she held that photograph in both hands. Outside, somewhere above her, the windmill stood against the Montana sky, still, waiting, its blades frozen at odd angles by 20 years of disuse. She thought about Eli's drawing, the way he had put those blades against the paper as though he already knew their exact positions. She thought about her father's patience with broken things, the way he sat with them and listened before he touched them. She thought about $50,000 in a steel can and a key that had waited in a drawer for 2 years for the right hand to come and claim it. She opened the first letter. "My dearest children," it began. "If you are reading this, I hope you are together. I hope you are safe." She read until the cold in the cellar had worked its way through every layer she was wearing, and the flashlight battery had begun to dim at the edges, and the sky through the gaps in the floorboards above her had shifted from black to the deep indigo that comes before dawn in high country. She read all of it. When she was finished, she sat for a long time with the photograph of her father and the silver-haired man, and she understood that she had not simply inherited a broken house and a stopped windmill and $50,000 in the dark. She had inherited a war. The first thing Nora did in the morning was find her father's workshop. She had slept in the cellar wrapped in her jacket with the document box pulled close against her side, and when the light coming through the gaps above her had strengthened enough to be useful, she climbed the stone steps back into the main room and stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. The house looked different in daylight. Not better exactly, but more honest. The damage was clearer, and so were the bones beneath it. She could see that the walls were solid, that the floors, though warped in places, had not rotted through. That someone had built this house with the intention of it lasting, and it had largely complied, enduring the neglect of 2 decades without fully surrendering to it. The barn was behind the house, separated from it by a stretch of overgrown yard. She pushed through the weeds and pulled open the barn door and found what she was looking for. Her father's workshop occupied the entire left wall. His tools hung in precise rows on a pegboard, each one silhouetted against a painted outline of itself, so that a missing tool announced its own absence. The workbench below them was worn smooth by years of use, the wood darkened at the edges from countless hours of hands and sleeves and the friction of sustained concentration. Everything was covered in a uniform layer of dust, but nothing had rusted beyond use. Someone had oiled these tools and arranged them with care, and the care had held even across 20 years of emptiness. Taped to the underside of the shelf above the workbench, she found the notebooks. There were 11 of them. Composition books with marbled covers, their spines reinforced with electrical tape. Her father's handwriting filled every page. She pulled one out at random and stood there in the cold morning light of the barn reading it. He had written instructions, detailed, methodical, accompanied by diagrams. How to assess structural damage in an old farmhouse. How to identify which boards had rotted through versus which ones were merely weathered and could be restored. How to patch a roof from the inside when you couldn't safely access the exterior. How to shore up a sagging porch column without removing the weight it was bearing. How to replace a broken window pane. How to check the integrity of a foundation. Step by step. Illustrated. Written in the same clear, patient hand that had once helped her with geometry homework, that had written her birthday cards, that had signed the permission slips for school trips she could no longer remember. He had known, not the specific circumstances, not that she would be 18 and alone and arriving in the dark with $42 and no skills that applied to the physical world of broken houses. But he had known that whoever came to this place might need to start from nothing, and he had left a guide for starting from nothing. He had sat in this workshop, probably in the evenings after work, and filled 11 notebooks with everything a person would need to know to bring this house back from where he knew it would be by the time someone came. She stood at that workbench for a long time. The grief that moved through her was different from the grief in the cellar. The cellar grief had been sharp and sudden. This one was slower and in some ways heavier. This was the grief of being understood by someone who was no longer there to be thanked. She selected 3 notebooks, the ones that covered the most immediate repairs, and carried them back to the house. She spent the first 3 days learning things she had never needed to know. How to pull a warped board without splitting it. How to assess which porch columns could be saved and which ones needed to be replaced entirely. How to board windows properly against wind and precipitation. She worked from first light until she could no longer see what she was doing, breaking only to eat from the supplies she had bought with some of the money from the milk can during a 4-mile round trip walk to Cedar Hollow. She bought only what she could carry. She bought only what she needed. On the 3rd evening, sitting on the porch steps, eating a peanut butter sandwich, and watching the sun go down behind the mountains, she allowed herself to look at the windmill. It stood against the darkening sky exactly as it had when she arrived. Still, frozen, its bent blades catching the last light in a way that was almost beautiful, the way ruins can be beautiful when they're not yours to fix. She would get to it. Not yet, but she would get to it. On the 4th morning, she walked the 2 miles into Driftwood proper. The town in daylight was not substantially more alive than it had been at night. The church was boarded. Most of the houses were dark. The gas station was obviously non-functional. But at the center of the crossroads stood a building that was clearly still operational, its windows clean, a hand-lettered sign above the door. Hale's General Store, dry goods and hardware, since 1962. A bell above the door announced her arrival. The interior was exactly what the exterior suggested. A little of everything organized with the logic of a place that has been serving the same small community for 60 years and knows precisely what that community needs. Hardware on the left wall, canned goods and dry staples in the center aisles, first aid supplies near the back, a rack of hunting licenses and fishing permits beside the counter. Behind the counter stood a man who matched the establishment. He was somewhere in his mid-70s, she estimated, with a face that the weather had worked on extensively and eyes that had arrived at the far end of a very long road and were not particularly surprised by anything they found there. He watched her approach without expression. "You're the girl at the old Ashwell place," he said. It was not a question. "I am," Nora said. She set her items on the counter. Nails in 3 sizes, sandpaper, a tube of weather stripping, bread, peanut butter, 2 cans of soup, batteries. He rang them up with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this for decades and had made peace with the pace of it. "Heard someone was working on it," he said. "I'm trying." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "Birch Hale," he said. "Nora Ashwell." He nodded once as though that confirmed something. Then he reached under the counter and produced a phone. A simple device, basic, the kind that made calls and nothing else. He set it on the counter beside her change. She looked at it, then at him. "My number's the only one in it," he said. "You need anything, anything at all, you call that number." He paused. "Your parents were good people. This town remembers that, those of us still left who are worth remembering anything." She picked up the phone slowly. "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment. His hands rested flat on the counter, still and deliberate. "I had a son," he said finally. "Raymond. He was healthy his whole life, strong as anything, the kind of young man who never got sick. He started getting sick in 1987. We didn't know why. The doctors didn't know why. By 1991, he was gone, 32 years old." He looked past her at the store's single window and the empty street beyond it. "Our well water changed in 1986. We noticed it, mentioned it to the county. The county said they'd look into it, and then they didn't." He brought his eyes back to her face. "Your father was the first person who ever came to this town and told me what was in that water and where it came from." He paused. He did that knowing what it might cost him, and it cost him everything. His jaw tightened. "So yes, Miss Ashwell, you need anything, you call." She walked back to the farmhouse carrying her supplies and the phone and a new understanding of the landscape she was in. She was not simply in a place her parents had chosen. She was in a place her father had already changed, even briefly, even in ways that hadn't been enough to save him. The people of Driftwood who were still here had been changed by him, by what he had told them and what he had tried to do and what had been done to him for trying. She was not starting from nothing. She was continuing something. 2 days later, a car came up Miller Road. She was on the roof following her father's instructions for assessing the condition of the shingles when she heard it. She stayed where she was and watched. A rental car, clean and anonymous. It parked at the end of the drive and a young woman got out. Late teens or very early 20s. A messenger bag over one shoulder. She stood looking up at the house with the focused attention of someone cataloging details. "You're Nora Ashwell," the young woman called up. Nora climbed down carefully. "Who are you, Willa Hale?" "My grandfather called me at school. Said there was someone I needed to meet." She had her grandfather's eyes, the same quality of attention, the same sense of having already processed several possibilities before settling on the one in front of her. She was carrying a laptop bag. Inside the messenger bag, Nora could see the outline of it. "He told you about my parents. He told me about the evidence they collected and what your father was trying to expose." She met Nora's eyes directly. "I'm a journalism student. 2nd year. My grandfather has been telling me about Van Thorn mining since I was old enough to understand what those words meant. Raymond was my uncle. I never met him, but I grew up knowing his name and what happened to him and why." She paused. "I want to help." Nora studied her for a moment. Then she stepped back from the porch and held the door. "Come inside," she said. They worked for 3 days before the hard drive arrived. In that time, Nora came to understand that Willa Hale operated on a combination of genuine talent and barely contained urgency, as though she had been waiting her whole life for something specific to point herself at, and had now found it. She set up encrypted accounts and cloud backups and established communication channels with Grafton Payne that Nora would not have known how to begin creating. She was methodical in a way that was different from her grandfather's methodical, faster, and more technical, but driven by the same underlying seriousness. The hard drive came via courier to a post office box in Cedar Hollow that Payne had established for this purpose. Nora picked it up on a gray Wednesday morning and brought it back to the farmhouse, and they opened it together at the kitchen table, Willa's laptop humming between them. What was on it was everything her mother's letter had promised and then more. Spreadsheets, hundreds of them organized by site and date and chemical compound, documenting the disposal of industrial waste in groundwater recharge zones across 5 Montana counties. The earliest entries dated to 1984. The most recent were dated 3 weeks before her parents died, as though her father had been updating the record right up until the end. Internal memoranda. Emails between executives discussing the disposal program in language that was not quite direct enough to constitute explicit admission, but was sufficiently clear when read in sequence. The phrase ongoing legacy management appeared frequently. So did the phrase rural compliance margin, which Willa, reading over her shoulder, identified without hesitation as a euphemism for the assumption that people in isolated rural areas would not organize effective resistance to corporate malfeasance. Audio files. Her father's voice recorded in what sounded like a car or a small room, narrating the circumstances of each meeting before the meeting began. Then the meetings themselves. She listened to them in sequence with her hands folded in her lap and her face as still as she could keep it. Her father's voice was exactly as she remembered. Calm, patient, precise. He asked questions in the way he had, not confrontationally, but with a persistence that eventually made evasion more costly than response. She could hear the men he was speaking with becoming uncomfortable, could hear them looking for ways out of answers they hadn't expected to have to give. The final audio file was different. It began mid-conversation, as though her father had activated the recording late or the opening had been cut. The voice on the other end was smooth and measured, the voice of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. "Marcus," the voice said, "you're a smart man. Surely you understand that what you're describing, the report you claim to have prepared, would be extraordinarily destabilizing to a great many people." Her father said something she couldn't quite hear. The other voice continued, "You have a daughter. Nora isn't at 14 years old, and a son, Eli, 12, both at Jefferson Middle School. Your wife drives them on Tuesdays and Fridays. She takes Miller Street." Silence. "We're not unreasonable people," the voice said. "We understand that a man in your position feels a certain moral obligation. We respect that. We're simply asking you to consider the full cost of the position you're taking." Willa reached over and stopped the playback. Nora sat very still. "That's Garrett Holloway," Willa said quietly. "Executive Vice President of Van Thorn Mining for the past 22 years. She paused. "He's the one who gave the order." Nora knew this already from her mother's letters, but knowing it and hearing the voice that had said her own name and her brother's name on a recording her father had made in the weeks before he died were two entirely different things. She heard herself at 14 on that recording. She heard Eli at 12. She heard the street their mother drove on Tuesdays and Fridays translated into a threat by a man in an expensive suit who had weighed 2 children's lives against the cost of his company's exposure and found them insufficient reason to stop. She reached over and opened the audio file again. She listened to it all the way through. She needed to hear it completely, every word, every pause. She needed to know exactly what she was carrying. When it was finished, she sat for a moment. Then she said, "What about the photograph? The man with my father in the lobby." Willa had been expecting this. She pulled up a file she had already found and turned the laptop so Nora could see. A name, an official photograph, a title below it. State Senator, currently serving his 4th term, Chairman of the Montana Environmental Quality Committee. The man in the photograph had signed every falsified environmental assessment Van Thorn had submitted to state regulators over a period of 12 years. Willa had found the originals and the falsified versions in adjacent folders on the hard drive, paired side by side, as though her father had wanted whoever found them to see the comparison without having to search. "This is bigger than the company," Nora said. "Much bigger." Willa looked at her steadily. "Which means the people trying to stop you have more to lose than you probably accounted for." 4 days after Willa's arrival, the man in the expensive suit came up Miller Road. Nora was working on the porch columns when she heard the car. She set down her tools and waited. The man who got out was middle-aged and unhurried, moving with the ease of someone who has never had occasion to doubt that the world would accommodate him. His suit cost more than the entire contents of the farmhouse. His expression was arranged in a configuration that he probably thought of as reasonable. "Miss Ashwell," he said, "my name is Lawrence Gould. I represent certain parties with an interest in this property." She said nothing. He smiled. "You've done some work here, I can see that." He looked around at the porch, the replaced boards, the new windows she'd installed. "That's commendable. But you must understand that a property like this with the environmental history it has, the remediation cost alone would be staggering. My clients are prepared to take it off your hands and spare you all of that." She kept her face neutral. "What are they offering?" $2 million. He let the number land and settle. "That's enough to set yourself up for life, Miss Ashwell. You could go to college, get your brother out of the system, build whatever future you want. $2 million, and you walk away free and clear. $2 million. The number was not abstract to her. She understood exactly what it meant in practical terms. It meant Eli out of the facility in Billings immediately. It meant stable housing, education, everything the system had failed to provide. It meant that the orphaned daughter of murdered parents could acquire in a single transaction more security than either of her parents had managed to accumulate in their entire lives. All she had to do was give Van Thorn mining the land where her father had hidden the truth. All she had to do was let them bury it alongside everything else they had buried. "No," she said. Gould's smile held but changed at the edges. "I beg your pardon, I said no." She looked at him directly. "This land belonged to my parents. They died because of what your clients did. I'm not selling it to you so you can erase what they found. Not for $2 million, not for any amount." Something moved behind his eyes. Something that was not quite anger and not quite surprise, but had elements of both. The mask of reasonableness slid slightly and then reasserted itself. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card. He set it on the porch railing. "In case you change your mind," he said, "I hope you'll think carefully, Miss Ashwell. The offer won't stay on the table indefinitely." He walked back to his car. She watched him go. That night, she woke to orange light pulsing against her bedroom ceiling. She was outside in 30 seconds. The storage shed at the edge of the property was fully involved, the fire eating through the old dry wood with a speed that told her it had been burning for longer than she'd slept. She filled buckets from the creek and made 3 runs toward the shed before the heat drove her back. By the time she accepted that the shed was lost, it was already mostly gone. She stood in the yard and watched it burn. In the morning, she found a note pinned to the front door. 5 words, "Last chance. Learn when to quit." She took the note inside and added it to the growing file in the document box. Then she called Grafton Payne. She told him about Gould's offer to fire the note. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said that he had been in contact with an investigative journalist named Tessa Marsh, who had been building a case against Van Thorn for 3 years, waiting for someone to provide the documentation that would make the story publishable. With the hard drive, they finally had it. He was also in preliminary conversations with Derek Wren, a former environmental engineer who had worked for Van Thorn for 15 years and had left 3 years ago with a conscience that had not given him a moment's peace since. "We're close," Payne said. "Give me 10 days. Then came the call that changed everything. It was Mrs. Dunmore at the facility in Billings, and her voice when Nora answered had the tight, controlled quality of someone working to keep panic from being audible. "Nora, thank God. There was a man here yesterday. He had credentials, proper identification, official-looking paperwork. He said he was conducting routine welfare checks on several residents. He asked about you, where you had gone, whether you'd been in contact with Eli, whether you'd mentioned anything about your plans or a property." Nora's hand tightened around the phone. "He met with Eli privately, in the common room where I could see them but not hear. About 10 minutes. And then Mrs. Dunmore's voice dropped. After he left, I checked his credentials. The agency he claimed to represent doesn't exist. I ran the ID number. It was fabricated. Did Eli seem upset afterward?" "He seemed—" She paused, considering. He seemed like he understood something that I didn't, which worried me more than upset would have. Nora stood very still. Is he safe right now? He's in the building. I have staff with him. Don't let anyone speak to him without you present, Nora said. If that man comes back, call the police immediately. I don't care what credentials he shows. Nora, what is happening? I can't explain everything right now, but please keep him close. Please. She hung up and stood in the kitchen of her parents' farmhouse and felt the full weight of what Van Thorn was doing. They had sent a man to sit across from her 14-year-old brother in a room full of children and deliver a message that required no words. A message that said, we know where he is and we can reach him whenever we choose to, and your continued presence at that property is the variable that determines what we choose. She called Payne again. His line rang 4 times and then a voice she didn't recognize answered and told her that Mr. Payne was unavailable and that she should try again the following week. She called Willa, who was back at school, but reachable by the encrypted channel they had set up. Willa called back in 11 minutes, which was how long it took her to drive off campus to a location she trusted. There's more, Willa said before Nora could finish speaking. Derek Wren. He was supposed to sign the witness agreement with Payne this morning. He didn't show. I've been trying to locate him for the past 6 hours. One of Payne's contacts found him at a motel off the highway outside of Missoula. He's there voluntarily, technically, but Van Thorn has people parked outside. He's not going to testify. Not if they can help it. Willa's voice was steady but tight. Without him, we have documentation. We have audio recordings. But we don't have a living witness who worked inside the company. Defense attorneys will go after the chain of custody on the hard drive, and without someone to corroborate what's on it from direct experience, there's a real chance the material gets challenged into inadmissibility. Nora was quiet for a moment. What about Payne? That's the other thing. She paused. Van Thorn filed a complaint with the state bar this morning. They're alleging misconduct in the establishment of the original trust. It's almost certainly fabricated. But while it's under review, Payne has to step back from active representation. He could be disbarred if he proceeds while the complaint is open. In a single day, Nora had lost her lawyer, her witness, and her brother's safety. She sat down on the porch steps in the early evening dark. The mountains to the west were silhouettes now black against a sky that had gone the deep greenish blue that comes just before the stars appear. The windmill stood at the edge of her vision, its blades motionless. Somewhere in the trees, a bird called once and was silent. She thought about the phrase that kept appearing in her father's documentation files. Legacy management. The words Van Thorn used internally for what they were doing to the land and the water and the people. Legacy management. As though the consequences of their choices were simply an administrative matter, something to be organized and minimized and filed away where it wouldn't cause problems. Her parents had been legacy managed. Raymond Hale had been legacy managed. The remaining people of Driftwood had been legacy managed. She pulled out the burner phone and called her brother. He answered on the second ring. Hey, he said. Hey. She kept her voice even. A man came to talk to you yesterday. Yeah. What did he say? He told me you were in trouble. He said if I wanted to help you, I should call a number he gave me and tell them where you were. He paused. I didn't call. She closed her eyes. Good. That was the right thing. I know. His voice was quiet. Nora, are you okay? I'm working on it. She opened her eyes and looked at the windmill. Eli, I need you to stay close to Mrs. Dunmore. Don't go anywhere with anyone you don't know. Not for any reason. Can you do that? Yeah, I can do that. He paused. Are you going to win? She sat with the question. The mountains had gone fully dark. The first stars were appearing faint at first and then definitive, the way things that have always been there become visible when the light changes. She thought about her father sitting in that workshop writing 11 notebooks of instructions for a daughter he might not live to see arrive. She thought about her mother sealing a letter with a wax stamp and leaving instructions that it be delivered on a specific date 2 years after her death. She thought about the love that expresses itself as practical preparation, as 11 notebooks and a key in a sealed envelope, and instructions for what to do when everything goes wrong. She thought about what she had said to Lawrence Gould on the porch. Not for any amount. She had meant it then. She meant it more now. "I'm going to win," she said. "It might take a few more days, but I'm going to win." She hung up and sat on the porch of the house her parents had bought for $5, entrusted to an iron key and a daughter they had bet everything on. The hearing was in 4 days. She had no lawyer, no witness, in a corporation that had been managing consequences for 40 years and was very good at it. She had her father's notebooks and her mother's letters and $50,000 in a steel can and a hard drive full of evidence that the right person in the right position could use to burn Van Thorn Mining to the ground. She had Eli's drawing in her jacket pocket. She had a windmill that hadn't moved in 20 years and 11 notebooks that told her exactly why it had stopped and exactly how to make it move again. She stood up from the porch steps and went inside to figure out what came next. She left before dawn. The road to Missoula was 2 hours in the old pickup truck she had spent 3 evenings getting running, following instructions her father had left in the 7th notebook under the heading Small Engine Resurrection, which she had found both practical and, in the current circumstances, something close to poetry. The engine coughed and complained for the first 10 miles, and then settled into a rhythm that was not exactly confidence-inspiring, but was functional, which was all she needed it to be. She had called Willa the night before and gotten the name of the motel and the approximate position of the 2 Van Thorn vehicles that had been parked outside since the previous morning. She had not told Willa what she was planning because she was not entirely certain herself. She knew only that Derek Wren was the last piece that mattered, and that waiting for someone else to retrieve him was a strategy that had already failed. The motel was a single-story building off the highway, the kind of place that had stopped trying to attract anyone in particular and had settled into serving whoever needed a room without questions. She spotted the 2 vehicles immediately, a black SUV near the entrance and a sedan parked at the far end of the lot with a clear sight line to the room numbers. She drove past without slowing, circled the block, and came back in from the other direction. Parking on the street behind the motel's laundry facility, she sat in the truck for a moment. She had the recorder from the farmhouse in her jacket pocket, the same small device she had used to catalog the audio files on her father's hard drive. She had the phone. She had her father's letter folded inside her jacket against her ribs, alongside Eli's drawing. She got out and walked to room 14, which Willa had identified from the motel registry, and knocked. Nothing for a long moment, then movement behind the door. Then a voice careful and controlled and trying to sound like neither of those things. "Who is it?" "My name is Nora Ashwell," she said. "My father was Marcus Ashwell. I think you knew him." The silence that followed was different from the first silence. This one had weight in it. She could feel the decision being made on the other side of the door, the internal negotiation of a man who had been running from something for 3 years and had just had that something knock on his door at 6 in the morning. The door opened. Derek Wren was in his early 50s, she estimated, with the kind of face that suggested he had once been physically substantial and had spent recent years diminishing. He had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't slept properly in a long time. Not weeks, but years, the accumulated debt of a conscience that had never been allowed to settle. He was dressed as though he had slept in his clothes, which she suspected he had. He looked at her for a long moment. "You look like him," he said finally, "around the eyes." She stepped past him into the room. He let her. She pulled the desk chair out and sat down without waiting to be invited and set the recorder on the desk between them. He looked at the recorder, then at her. "I know why you're here," he said. "Then let's not take longer than we need to." He sat on the edge of the bed. His hands were clasped between his knees, a posture she recognized as the body's way of holding itself together when it would prefer to come apart. "They've made it very clear what happens if I testify," he said. "It's not just me. My daughter is in college in Bozeman. My sister lives in Helena. They know exactly where both of them are." She looked at him steadily. "I know. Then you understand why I can't." She reached into her jacket and took out the recorder. She found the audio file she had bookmarked the night before and pressed play. Her father's voice filled the small room. Calm, patient, precise. And then Holloway's voice smooth and measured, and then her own name and her brother's name, and the school they had attended, and the street their mother drove on Tuesdays and Fridays, all of it delivered with the pleasant reasonableness of a man who understood that the most effective threat is one that never quite announces itself as a threat. She stopped the playback. Derek Wren had not moved while it was playing. He was looking at the floor. They said those exact words to my father, she said. He was sitting across from Garrett Holloway, and Holloway named his children and named the street his wife drove, and called it a conversation about moral obligations and professional considerations. And then my father kept working. He kept building the case. Because he understood that stopping meant it continued, and it had already gone on for 20 years, and people were already dead. She paused. He was killed 6 weeks after that recording was made. She kept her voice level. So I understand what you're afraid of. I understand it exactly. I'm not here to tell you that the fear is wrong or that the risk isn't real. I'm here to tell you that my father stood in this exact position and made a choice. And what happened to him was the worst possible outcome. And even so, the evidence he gathered is still intact, and it is still going to matter because I am going to make it matter. With or without you. She stood up and picked up the recorder. But without you, she continued, they're going to challenge every document on that hard drive. They're going to hire experts to question the chain of custody and the authenticity, and they're going to create enough doubt that a judge might exclude it. And then the people who poisoned 5 counties for 40 years are going to walk out of a courtroom and go back to doing what they do. And your daughter in Bozeman and my brother in Billings are going to grow up in a world where that happened and nobody stopped it. She put the recorder back in her pocket. My father stood alone, she said. He died for it. I've been standing alone for the past 3 weeks, and I intend to keep standing. I'm just asking if you're willing to stand somewhere near me. Not in front. Not instead of me. Near me. The room was very quiet. Derek Wren looked at his hands for a long moment. Then he looked up at her, and she saw in his face the expression of a man who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has just been given, against all reasonable expectation, a reason to put it down. Where do I sign? He said. She called Grafton Payne from the truck before she left the motel parking lot. He answered on the second ring, which meant the step back from active representation had not extended to ignoring his phone at 6:30 in the morning. I have Derek Wren, she said. He's ready to sign the witness agreement. What do I need to do? Payne was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then he said, get him to my office by noon. I'll have the paperwork ready. The bar complaint. I found a colleague willing to co-counsel while the complaint is under review. It keeps me in the case on a technical basis that will not survive sustained scrutiny, but will survive long enough. His voice carried the satisfaction of a man who has found a legal solution that is not quite comfortable and does not care. How are you holding up? She looked out through the cracked windshield at the Montana morning. The sky had come up clear, the kind of blue that appears in high country after cold nights, so definitive it seems intentional. Ask me in 4 days, she said. The next 72 hours moved in a way that felt both very fast and strangely suspended, the way time moves when the thing you've been building toward is finally close enough to feel the heat of. Willa came back from school and set up the war room in the farmhouse's main room, which was the only space large enough for what was needed. Maps and documents covered the walls. 2 laptops ran constantly. Grafton Payne drove up from Billings and worked at the kitchen table, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, surrounded by stacks of documents that he moved through with the methodical patience of a man who had spent 40 years in the law and understood that preparation was the opposite of a strategy, not the same thing. Tessa Marsh called from Helena on the second morning. She had been the investigative reporter Payne had mentioned weeks ago, the one who had been circling Van Thorn for 3 years, building context and background, while she waited for someone to provide the documentation that would make the story publishable rather than merely suggestive. She had a voice that was brisk and precise and gave the impression of someone who had trained herself to move quickly through information because she had learned that the information didn't wait. She asked Nora 3 questions: whether she was willing to be named in the article, whether she understood what being named would mean in terms of public exposure, whether she had any reservations about the timing. To all 3, Nora said no, yes, and no. Good, Tessa said. The piece runs day after tomorrow. Morning edition. The night before the article published, Nora sat on the porch alone. Willa was inside working. Payne had gone back to his hotel in Cedar Hollow to sleep in a bed for the first time in 3 days. The farmhouse behind her was lit and occupied and purposeful in a way it had clearly not been for 20 years. And she was aware of the strangeness of that, of the fact that this place her parents had prepared and then never reached had finally become what they had meant it to be. Not a refuge exactly, something more active than refuge. A place where something was being built. She thought about Birch Hale, who had come by that afternoon with a bag of groceries he set on the porch without comment, and then stood for a while looking at the windmill. Getting close, he had said, meaning the hearing. Getting close, she had agreed. He had nodded. Raymond always said the hardest part wasn't the fight. It was the waiting before it. He said that was when people talked themselves out of things. He looked at her with those eyes that had seen too much and arrived at something beyond surprise. Don't talk yourself out of anything. She thought about her father's voice on the recording. Calm, patient, precise, even with Holloway across from him, naming his children like items on a list. She thought about the 11 notebooks in the workshop, each one a form of love, expressed as practical instruction. She thought about her mother sealing a letter with a wax stamp and leaving it in a drawer to be delivered 2 years after her death, trusting that her daughter would be equal to what was inside it. She reached into her jacket and took out Eli's drawing. In the dim light from the farmhouse windows, she could just make out the lines of it. The house with the wide porch, the windmill rising beside it, the 2 figures in the doorway hand in hand. He had drawn this before he knew it existed. She folded it carefully and put it back. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow we find out. The article published at 6 in the morning. By 8, it was the most read piece on the paper's website. By 10, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By noon, Garrett Holloway's name was appearing on cable news, accompanied by the audio clip of him telling Marcus Ashwell about his daughter and his son in the street their mother drove on Tuesdays and Fridays. Tessa Marsh had included a transcript of the recording alongside the article, and hearing it and reading it simultaneously produced an effect that was visceral in a way that neither alone would have been. Van Thorn mining stock began dropping before the market had been open an hour. The EPA issued a statement before noon indicating that it was reviewing the documentation published in the article and had opened a preliminary investigation. The FBI field office in Helena confirmed that it had received the evidence package forwarded by Grafton Payne 3 days earlier and that the matter was under active review. 4 state legislators who had received campaign contributions from Van Thorn issued statements distancing themselves from the company before the afternoon was out. 2 of them called explicitly for the resignation of the state senator whose name appeared in the article as the signatory of 12 years of falsified environmental reports. The senator himself issued no statement. His office did not return calls. Nora watched some of this from the kitchen of the farmhouse on Willa's laptop, and some of it she didn't watch at all because there was still work to do before the morning, and watching the consequences of a thing is not the same as finishing it. She went over her testimony with Payne for 2 hours that evening. He asked her questions in the way he had explained a defense attorney would ask them, looking for inconsistencies, looking for moments where her account could be made to seem uncertain or motivated by something other than truth. She answered everything directly and without elaboration, which he told her was correct, and she told him she had learned directness from a system that punished everything else. He smiled at that. It was the first time she had seen him smile. "Get some sleep," he said. "The hearing starts at 9. She slept 4 hours and woke before the alarm." The courtroom in Cedar Hollow was not large. It served a county with a small permanent population and had been built for the scale of the community's ordinary disputes, property lines and water rights, and the occasional matter of more serious criminal concern. It was not built for the number of people who arrived on the morning of the hearing. Journalists had come from Helena and Billings, and 2 from out of state, Their vans parked along the single main road in a line that constituted by a considerable margin the largest traffic event Driftwood had seen in 2 decades. Local people had come as well, residents of the 5 affected counties, some of them driving for hours, some of them in wheelchairs, or moving with the careful deliberateness of people whose bodies had been compromised by years of contaminated water. They filled the gallery to capacity and stood along the walls when the seats were gone. Birch Hale was in the front row directly behind the respondent's table. He had worn a jacket she had not seen before, dark and carefully pressed, and he sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes forward with the stillness of a man who has waited a long time for something and intends to be fully present when it arrives. Garrett Holloway was there. She had known he would be. His attorneys had required his presence as a show of force, the corporate executive attending personally to demonstrate that the company did not consider this matter serious enough to warrant anything other than calm institutional response. He was smaller in person than she had expected from the recordings. A compact man in a dark suit, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had probably been called distinguished for so long that the word had stopped meaning anything specific. He sat at the plaintiff's table with 3 attorneys arranged around him and watched Nora cross the room to her seat with an expression of studied neutrality that she recognized as a civilian version of what she had heard in his voice on the recording. Their eyes met. She held his gaze for a count of 3 and then looked away, not because she was intimidated, but because she had decided before she walked in that she would not spend her energy on him. He was not the point. He was the consequence. The proceedings began. Van Thorn's attorneys were skilled and well-prepared and operating with the focused aggression of people who understood that the legal situation had deteriorated significantly overnight and that the hearing this morning was now less about winning and more about preventing total collapse. They challenged the trust documents, citing what they called irregularities in the notarization process. They challenged the chain of custody on the hard drive. They argued that a minor with no legal guardian and no established income had been manipulated by outside parties, specifically Grafton Payne, into making claims on property to which she had no legitimate entitlement. Payne dismantled each argument in the order it was presented. The trust documents were legitimate, notarized by 2 independent witnesses whose signatures he had independently verified and whose depositions were submitted as exhibits. The chain of custody on the hard drive was established through a sworn affidavit from the courier service that had transported it and confirmed by the digital forensic specialist who had examined it for tampering. The argument about manipulation was addressed by presenting Celeste Ashwell's letter in its original sealed envelope alongside the postmark records from the facility where it had been held. Then Derek Wren took the stand. He had slept, she could tell. He was still not the picture of ease, but there was a quality to his bearing that had changed from the motel room, as though he had set something down and found himself lighter than he expected. He answered Payne's questions in a voice that was measured and precise, the voice of an engineer describing technical processes, which was exactly what he was doing. He described the disposal sites. He described the internal approval process for each dump. He described the meetings at which the decision to continue the program was made and remade annually over a period of more than 15 years. He named names, he confirmed dates, he explained the chemical compounds involved and their known effects on groundwater and the people who depended on it. Van Thorn's lead attorney cross-examined him for 40 minutes and did not find a seam. Then Payne called Nora. She walked to the witness stand and sat down and looked out at the courtroom. She saw Birch in the front row, his hands still on his knees, his face composed. She saw Willa in the third row with her laptop open recording. She saw the journalists and the people from the affected counties and the empty space where her parents were not. She saw Holloway watching her. Payne's questions were direct and simply worded, designed to let her tell the story in the sequence that would be clearest to the judge. She told it. She described the envelope and what was inside it. She described the journey to Driftwood, in the cellar, in the milk can. She described her parents as she had known them, her father's patience with broken things and her mother's fierceness when her family was threatened, and the love that expressed itself as practical preparation, as 11 notebooks in a workshop and a key in a sealed envelope, and instructions for what to do when everything went wrong. When Payne asked about Eli, she talked about the drawing, the windmill house he had put on paper before either of them knew such a place existed. There was a sound in the gallery that was not quite a sound, more a collective held breath, and she saw two of the observers touch their eyes. Then Van Thorn's attorney stood up. He was a man named Bassett who had the compact efficiency of someone who had spent his career finding the specific angle of attack that destabilized a witness and had identified what he believed to be hers. He went after the documents, first establishing through a series of technical questions that Nora had no expertise in legal documents and could not herself verify their authenticity. He established that she had been 16 when she entered the foster system and had had no contact with any attorney or legal representative during those 2 years, meaning everything she knew about the trust had come through third parties. Then he pivoted. "Miss Ashwell," he said, "you've testified that you recognized your mother's handwriting on the letter found in the envelope. Is that correct?" "Yes, but you were 16 when your mother died. You had had no contact with any document in your mother's handwriting. In the 2 years between her death and the delivery of this envelope, I kept some things. A grocery list, a birthday card. So your recognition of the handwriting in this letter is based on comparison with a grocery list and a birthday card." His tone was not aggressive. It was politely skeptical, which was more dangerous. Not exactly the basis on which to stake a legal claim. She understood what he was doing. She had understood it was coming since the night before when Payne had warned her about the possibility of a handwriting challenge. But there was something Bassett did not know because it was not in any document he had been able to access. "Your Honor," she said, addressing the judge directly, "may I respond to this line of questioning directly?" The judge, a woman in her 60s who had been following the proceedings with the focused attention of someone keeping score, looked at her over her reading glasses. "Go ahead." Nora turned back to the courtroom. "The letter contains things that cannot be forged," she said. "Not handwriting. Things that only exist in memory. My mother made me a promise when I was 6 years old. We were painting together at the kitchen table, both of us with the same color red on our hands, and she told me that when we finally had a house that was truly ours, she was going to plant roses along the fence. Not because roses were practical," she said, "but because every house that is truly a home deserves something that exists for no reason except to be beautiful." She was looking at Bassett, but she was not speaking to him anymore. She was speaking to the room. "That promise is in the letter. Word for word, the roses along the fence. She said she never got to plant them, but she hoped I would someday. There is no document in any file anywhere that contains that conversation. It was between my mother and a 6-year-old girl with red paint on her hands, and it existed nowhere except in her memory and mine." She paused. "You can question the handwriting. You can question the notarization. You can question every technical element of every document in this case. But you cannot question that." The courtroom was silent. Bassett stood at his table with his legal pad in his hand and had nothing to say. The judge called a recess. When the proceedings resumed, Grafton Payne stood and addressed the court. He had reserved, he said, one additional piece of evidence. He presented it not as part of the property dispute, but as contextual information relevant to the court's understanding of the full circumstances of the case. He submitted to the court the contents of the third file on Marcus Ashwell's hard drive. The file contained 11 documents. Each one was an official Montana State Environmental Assessment. Each one bore the signature of a state official in his capacity as a member of the Environmental Quality Committee. And for each official document, the file contained the original assessment that the official document had been created to replace the actual findings that had been falsified, showing contamination levels, orders of magnitude above safe thresholds, drafted by state environmental scientists whose names appeared nowhere in the official record because their findings had been replaced before the official record was finalized. Payne read the name aloud: State Senator Edmund Hartwell, currently serving his 4th term, currently the chairman of the committee whose assessments he had been falsifying for 12 years in exchange for a total of $430,000 in documented payments from entities connected to Van Thorn Mining. The room broke open. The judge's gavel came down 3 times before the noise subsided to a level at which proceedings could continue. Nora sat at the respondent's table and looked at her hands and breathed. She heard Holloway's attorneys conferring behind her in low, urgent voices that were trying to be quieter than they were. She heard the gallery settling back into something that was not quite silence, but was the nearest approximation available. She heard the judge's voice, measured and authoritative, stating that the matter of Senator Hartwell's conduct was being referred immediately to the state attorney general's office and the FBI, and that the documentation would be forwarded by the court under seal. Then the judge ruled on the property. The trust was valid, the transfer was legal, the chain of custody on all submitted evidence was established. Nora Ashwell was the lawful owner of the property at Miller Road, Driftwood, Montana, including the dwelling and appurtenances in one windmill. She felt it land in her chest. Not triumph exactly, something quieter. The sensation of a weight that has been carried for long enough to feel like part of the body finally shifting to somewhere it could be put down. Garrett Holloway was arrested in the courthouse parking lot before he reached his car. She watched through the window. 2 FBI agents, unhurried and businesslike, the whole thing taking less than 3 minutes. Holloway's face as the handcuffs went on was the face of a man encountering for the first time in his professional life a consequence that had not been managed in advance. Senator Hartwell issued a resignation statement the following morning. His office did not elaborate on the reasons. She found Birch in the corridor outside the courtroom, standing with his cane, his jacket still carefully pressed, his face arranged in an expression that she had come to recognize over the past weeks as his version of emotion. Not the expression itself, but the stillness of a face working very hard not to show what it was feeling. She stood beside him and they looked out the courthouse's single window at the mountains. "Raymond," she said quietly. He was quiet for a moment. "And your parents, and all the rest." "All the rest," she agreed. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, the same gesture he had made weeks ago in the yard, the only physical acknowledgement of feeling she had ever seen from him. "You did a good thing today, Nora," he said. "A hard thing and a good one." He paused. "I'm going to go home and sleep. I believe I've earned it." She watched him make his way down the corridor, his cane tapping a slow rhythm on the old linoleum. She didn't know yet that it was the last time she would see him. The call came that night. Birch Hale had passed away in his sleep sometime in the hours after he returned home from the courthouse. Peacefully, the neighbor who called said, as though he had simply decided that the work was finished and he could rest. She sat with that for a long time in the kitchen of the farmhouse, the phone in her hand, the darkness outside complete and still. She thought about the grace that allows a person to hold on for exactly as long as something requires and then let go. Birch had waited 16 years for justice. He had outlasted his grief and his anger and the long humiliation of having no one believe what he knew. He had waited until the thing was done, and then he had gone home and closed his eyes. She drove to his house in the morning and stood in his yard for a while. The store was closed, its sign hanging still in the morning air. She stood in the yard and looked at the mountains and thought about how much of what she had accomplished had begun with an old man sliding a burner phone across the counter and saying your parents were good people. She went to the cemetery the day after that and stood at the grave that had been prepared beside his son's. The stone was simple, his name and dates. Someone had left a small American flag at its base, a tribute to his military service, which she had not known about and which somehow did not surprise her. Raymond's stone beside it was weathered and familiar, already absorbed into the landscape. "We did it," she said to both of them. "The company is finished, and the man who gave the order is in federal custody, and the senator who protected them for 12 years is gone. And the water." She paused. "They're going to clean the water. It's going to take years, but they're going to do it." She put her hand on Birch's stone for a moment. It was cold and solid, already beginning the long process of becoming part of the permanent landscape of this place. "Thank you," she said, "for believing in someone you had no particular reason to believe in. For Raymond. For all of it." She drove back to the farmhouse. The road was familiar now in a way it had not been when she first walked it in the dark 3 weeks ago with a flashlight and $42 and no idea what she was walking toward. She knew every rut. She knew where the pines pressed closest to the verge and where they opened up to let you see the mountains. She knew the particular way the light fell on the windmill in the afternoon, the way the rust caught it and turned it something close to gold. She had learned this road the same way she had learned everything here, by traveling it repeatedly until it became hers. Eli came home on a Tuesday 3 weeks after the hearing. Grafton Payne had worked something close to a legal miracle with the custody paperwork leveraging the outcome of the hearing and the settlement funds that were beginning to move through the class action process, and the straightforward fact that Nora Ashwell now owned clear title to a house with a functioning roof and repaired windows and a kitchen that worked and enough room for two people to begin again. A judge in Billings had reviewed the application and signed the order. Dunmore had called to confirm with a warmth in her voice that Nora had not heard before and suspected had always been there waiting for an occasion that called for it. She drove the old pickup to Billings. The engine ran the whole way without complaint, as though it had decided to participate in the occasion. The city looked different on the way in. Smaller somehow, or maybe just less significant. She had left it 8 weeks ago with nothing but what she could carry and a letter from a dead woman, and she was returning with a house and a legal victory and the kind of clarity about who she was that takes most people decades to arrive at, if they arrive at it at all. The streets were the same. The buildings were the same. She was not. Eli was waiting in the lobby of the Billings Transitional Youth Facility with a single backpack at his feet and his sketchbook tucked under his arm. He looked taller than he had 8 weeks ago, which was possible but seemed unlikely, and there was something different in the way he stood, a quality of readiness, as though he had been maintaining a particular posture of hope for a long time and had already begun in anticipation to relax it. She came through the glass doors and he saw her and the posture released entirely. She opened her arms. He crossed the lobby in 3 steps and she held him, and he held her back with the full strength of his 14-year-old arms, and they stood in the institutional lobby while Mrs. Dunmore watched from the far side of the room, and the building continued its ordinary sounds around them. She felt him breathe, really breathe, the kind of breath that comes after you've been holding something in for a very long time. "Okay," he said into her shoulder. "Okay." The drive back was 4 hours. Eli spent most of it with his face turned toward the window, watching the landscape transform the way it always did on that road. The city simplifying into suburbs, simplifying into farmland, and then into the open country where the horizon finally ran uninterrupted in every direction. She watched him from the corner of her eye and said very little. The silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that exists between people who know each other well enough to understand that some things don't need filling. When they turned onto the dirt road toward Miller Road, she heard him sit up straighter in the seat. "There it is," he said. She didn't say anything. She just pulled up to the house and stopped the engine, and they both sat for a moment looking at it through the windshield. She had kept working in the weeks since the hearing. The porch was fully restored now, its columns solid and plumb, the boards even underfoot. She had painted the whole exterior a warm white she had chosen from the color cards at Hale's General Store, running her finger across the options and stopping at the one that felt right. The windows caught the afternoon light and returned it cleanly. The garden plot she had cleared and turned and planted along the south wall was showing its first growth, small and tentative, but unmistakably alive. The windmill stood above everything. Its blades were still. She had not yet completed the final repair that would allow it to catch the wind and turn. She had been saving that. "Wow," Eli said softly. "It's real," she said. "All of it." They spent the rest of the afternoon moving through the property together. She showed him the workshop, the tools in their rows, the 11 notebooks on the shelf. She showed him the cellar empty, now the milk can gone, and the document box in the house, and the money in an account that Payne had helped establish. She showed him the patch of earth along the south fence prepared and waiting. "Mom said roses," he said. "She said every home that is truly a home deserves something that exists for no reason except to be beautiful." He stood with that for a moment. "That sounds like her." "It does." She showed him the room. Her father's notes had described the bedroom with the window facing the windmill. She had repaired the floor and cleaned the walls and put a bed in it from the second-hand store in Cedar Hollow and a small table and a lamp. On the wall above the table, she had taped a clean sheet of drawing paper and left a set of pencils in a cup below it. She hadn't told him. She just led him to the doorway and let him see it. He stood there for a long moment. "For me," he said. She nodded. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the windmill. The light was going gold and long, the particular light of Montana autumn evenings that makes everything look like it belongs in a painting. The windmill's blades caught it in the same way she had noticed from the first, the rust turning something close to warm. He turned around. His face had the expression she had been waiting 8 weeks to see. Not happiness exactly, though that was part of it. Something more fundamental. The expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they thought might not exist. In the evening, they climbed the windmill together. She had reinforced the ladder rungs the week before, replacing 3 that had corroded past safe use, and the platform at the top was solid, the railings checked and secured. They climbed in the long gold light of the evening, the sun already behind the mountains, but the sky above them still holding color, orange deepening toward rose, toward the deep clear blue that comes in the last few minutes before the stars. From the platform, they could see the whole valley spread below them, the farmhouse with its new paint catching the last light, the garden plot and the fence line where the roses would go, the road coming in from the east and the crossroads where driftwood stood, reduced but still standing. The mountains in every direction, their high elevations carrying the first snow of the season, white against the deep sky. The creek running through the lower field, catching what remained of the light and returning it in quick silver flashes. Eli stood beside her and looked at all of it without speaking. His sketchbook was inside. He was just looking. "Help me," she said. They braced themselves against the nearest blade together. Her shoulder against his against hers, the solid warmth of him beside her. She felt him draw a breath and hold it. "On 3, she said. 1, 2, 3. They pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. The blade resisted with the considerable inertia of 20 years of stillness, the rust and the accumulated weight of disuse, and the simple physical fact of a thing that had stopped moving and settled into its stopping. She pushed harder. He pushed harder. She felt the resistance building against her palms, and then something in the mechanism shifted. Some interior alignment reached the position it had been waiting for, and the blade moved. Slow at first, a degree, then 2, then the next blade caught, and the next. The rotation was tentative at first, the movement of something waking from a very long sleep, uncertain of its own capacity. And then the evening wind that moved through this valley at this hour, the wind that had been moving through this valley at this hour for 1,000 years before any of them were born, caught the blades, and the resistance became assistance, and the windmill turned. The sound it made was low and continuous, a hum that came from the mechanism and from the blades cutting the air and from something else she didn't have a name for. She had read her father's description of it in one of the notebooks written down from memory from what Birch had told him about the sound when he was a boy before it stopped. Her father had written it as the sound the land makes when everything is working the way it's supposed to. She thought that was as good a description as any. Eli made a sound beside her. Not a word. Something that came from further down than words. She understood it completely. She did not wipe her face. She let the tears run while the windmill turned above them, and the valley went dark below them, and the stars came out in the slow, methodical way they always did. One and then another, and then more than she could count, the same stars her parents had watched from the same piece of ground years ago, when they were still alive and still planning and still convinced that they were going to make it here in time. She carried Eli's drawing in her jacket pocket all the way down the ladder. When she reached the ground, she took it out and unfolded it carefully in the dim light. The windmill in his drawing was turning. She was sure she had looked at it 100 times before, and the blades had always been still. She looked again now and could not be certain. She folded it back along the same creases and put it in her pocket. Some things you don't need to be certain about. A year later, the farmhouse was complete in the way that houses used to be complete, meaning entirely functional and deeply lived in, and still full of small ongoing projects that would probably never be fully finished, which is another way of saying it was a home. The porch stretched wide across the front, furnished with two rocking chairs that she and Eli had built from lumber she had milled herself using instructions from the ninth notebook. The windows were clear and the floors were sound, and the kitchen was warm in the evenings, and the rooms held, in addition to furniture and light, the accumulated presence of people going about the ordinary, sustained work of living. The roses had come in along the south fence. She had planted them in early spring, bare root cuttings, ordered from a nursery in Missoula, and they had taken with a tenacity that felt earned. By late summer they were blooming, red and pale pink, and one variety that opened cream-colored and deepened toward rose as the days passed. They ran the full length of the fence in a continuous line that her mother had described to her at a kitchen table when she was 6 years old, with red paint on both their hands in a house that no longer existed in any form except memory. The roses existed now. The promise had been kept, just not by the person who made it. On the mantel in the living room, in a place she had chosen with care, sat the silver locket. She had finally added Eli's photograph to the empty space, a picture taken in the yard on the afternoon she brought him home, squinting a little into the autumn sun, his sketchbook under his arm. On the other side, unchanged, Marcus and Celeste on their wedding day. Both of them impossibly young, caught in a moment of joy, so uncomplicated that it still ached to look at directly. All four of them together in a frame smaller than her palm. In the barn on a morning in early spring, she went to the workshop for a hand plane she needed for a repair on the porch threshold. She had been in the workshop dozens of times by then, had used nearly every tool on the pegboard, had worn smooth patches into the workbench with her own sustained use. But she had never read through all 11 notebooks completely. She had used them the way her father intended them to be used, selectively, going to the relevant section for whatever task was at hand. That morning, looking for the hand plane, she knocked the 11th notebook from the shelf. It fell open to a page near the back, and she picked it up and started to close it, and then stopped. The notebook was the one about the windmill. Repair procedures, mechanical tolerances, the sequence of steps required to restore the rotation mechanism after extended disuse. She had read through it the previous fall carefully before she and Eli climbed up. She had stopped reading at the end of the technical section, page 34, because she had what she needed. The page it had fallen open to was page 35. There were no diagrams on page 35, no technical instructions, just handwriting smaller than usual, the letters pressed more carefully into the paper, as though her father had been uncertain whether he was going to write this, and had decided at the last moment that he was. If you've gotten this far, it means you fixed it. It means you stayed. She sat down on the workbench stool and held the notebook in both hands. I don't know which of you will find this. I wrote these notebooks for whoever comes, whatever child of mine or someone else's needs to know how to start again in a broken place. But if it's you, Nora, I want you to know something that your mother and I argued about, whether to put in any of the letters. We decided against it because we didn't want it to sound like a condition, like something you had to earn. But I'm putting it here at the end of the last notebook because whoever reads this far has already done the earning. We were not afraid to die. We were afraid of leaving you alone. Those are different fears, and I need you to understand that. The first one we made our peace with. The second one, we never could. You were never supposed to carry this, the weight of what we found, what we knew, what we had to do about it. That was ours. We tried to carry it far enough forward that it could be finished without you. We didn't make it far enough. But if you're reading this page, you did. You are exactly who we always believed you were. You have always been exactly that person. We saw it when you were small. We saw it in the way you watched the world, the way you couldn't look away from something wrong, even when looking away would have been so much easier. That quality used to worry your mother. She thought it would make your life hard. She was right. I'm sorry about that. But she also said more than once that she hoped you would never lose it, because the world needs people who can't look away. Keep the windmill turning, Nora. Keep the roses growing. Take care of your brother. And know that we loved you in ways we never found the right words for while we were alive to say them. We found the words now. We just ran out of time. All our love. Forever. Dad. She sat in the workshop for a long time after that. The morning light moved through the barn's small window and changed its angle against the pegboard and the tools and the worn surface of the workbench. Outside, she could hear the windmill turning, the low hum of it that she had come to think of as the sound of the place breathing. After a while, she heard the screen door open at the house and Eli's footsteps on the porch. She wiped her face. She put the notebook back on the shelf in its place between the 10th and the wall. She picked up the hand plane she had come for. She was still sitting on the stool when Eli appeared in the barn doorway. "You okay?" he said. She looked at him. 14 years old and already carrying himself like someone who knew what things were worth, who had learned the hard way that ordinary days in ordinary houses are not ordinary at all. "Yeah," she said. "Come look at something." She took him to the shelf and showed him the notebook. He read page 35 standing beside her with the morning light on his face, and she watched him read it and saw the moment it reached him, the subtle shift in his expression that was the same shift she had seen in his face on the platform of the windmill, the evening it turned. He didn't say anything when he finished. He just closed the notebook carefully and put it back on the shelf exactly where it belonged and stood there with his hand resting on the spine. She put her arm around his shoulders. They stood like that for a while in the workshop their father had built and stocked and left instructions in, listening to the windmill turn outside, listening to the morning go on around them the way mornings do, indifferent to grief and faithful to continuity, the light moving and the wind moving, and somewhere along the fence line the roses just beginning to open in the early warmth of an April that had arrived as April always does without asking anyone's permission. That evening she sat on the porch with Eli beside her and a mug in each hand, the same two chairs they had built together from the lumber and the instructions, and watched the windmill turn against a sky that was going through its evening colors, the orange and the rose and the deep clear blue. The valley below them was settling into dusk. The mountains were going dark at their bases, while their peaks still held the last light. Along the fence the roses held their shapes in the dimming, each bloom a small insistence on beauty, in a world that sometimes made beauty feel like a luxury. She thought about her mother's letter. Home isn't a place you're given. It's a place you build, sometimes from ruins. Sometimes you have to fight for the ground it stands on. She thought about her father's handwriting at the bottom of the last page of the last notebook. Keep the windmill turning. She thought about Birch Hale walking down the courthouse corridor for the last time, his cane tapping the old linoleum, saying, "I believe I've earned it." She thought about Raymond Hale, who had died at 32 and never knew that someone would eventually put a name to what killed him. She thought about all the people across those 5 counties who had drunk bad water and gotten sick and couldn't explain it, in the long, slow process now underway of cleaning what had been poisoned, which would take years, but had been started, which was the only way anything hard ever gets done. "Hey," Eli said. "Yeah, thanks for coming back." She looked at him. His face was serious in the way it had always been the face of someone who said only what he meant. She reached over and took his hand. "Always," she said. "That's what family does." The windmill turned. The stars came out. The roses along the fence held their shapes in the dark, each one a kept promise, each one proof that something beautiful can be grown in ground that was almost poisoned beyond recovery, if someone is willing to stay and tend it and refuse, absolutely refuse to let it go.